They said the mirror was a gift, but no one asked who it was meant for. The sisters of St. Rosalie's prayed before it, until their eyes grew hollow. Those who gazed too long did not see themselves, but something waiting behind. When the convent was abandoned, the mirror was left covered and locked in chains. No one has dared to touch it since. The camera drifts slowly, as though carried by air, into the stone corridors of a convent that no longer speaks. Dust lingers in the beams of pale light that cut through broken shutters. The air is heavy, unmoved, like a body holding its breath. And in the silence, a single object waits, concealed beneath a thick shroud of cloth. But before it was covered, before its surface became a thing of dread, it was called a gift. The year was 1884. St. Rosalie's Convent, set on the outskirts of a small European village, stood as a place of solemn worship, cut off from the noise of industry rising in the cities. The convent's walls were cold stone, its windows narrow, its chapel dimly lit with beeswax candles that flickered to the hours of prayer. For decades, the sisters lived in ritual silence, their days marked by bells and psalms, their nights spent in quiet submission to God. Nothing ever changed within those walls. Nothing was meant to. But that year, something new arrived. A carriage approached the convent gates, carrying within it a gift from a wealthy patron whose name was never spoken openly. He was a man who had once sought the prayers of the sisters, and now, years later, returned gratitude in material form. But the gift he chose was unlike anything they had ever received before. It was a mirror, not a small, functional piece such as might hang in a corridor or infirmary. This was a Venetian mirror, more than 8 feet tall, framed in gilt wood, decorated with carved angels whose wings folded in silence around its edges. It had been transported across the continent, carefully swaddled in cloth, carried by men who strained beneath its weight. The sisters gathered at the gate as it was delivered. They had seen little of the world outside the convent walls, and the object seemed impossibly luxurious. It was said to belong to a noble household, passed down for generations. But why such a mirror would be sent here, to a convent of poverty and prayer, was a question no one dared ask. The abbess, Mother Eugenia, received it with a solemn blessing. Her hands, thin and veined, traced the air before it as though sealing the object in prayer. She told the sisters it would stand in their chapel, reflecting the light of candles during evening mass, a symbol of clarity and purity. She said it was a divine blessing, and the sisters believed her, but not all of them. Even as the mirror was carried inside, some noticed the unease it stirred. Its size, its grandeur, its glittering surface, all seemed at odds with the humility of their vows. Sister Magdalena, one of the eldest, whispered to another that it was too large, too proud for such a place. Sister Agnes, still young and eager, counted that perhaps it was God's way of reminding them of heaven's glory. Their voices died as the heavy frame was lifted into the chapel. When the cloth was drawn back, the mirror stood unveiled, and for a moment, the sisters were silent. It reflected the chapel in exquisite detail. The flickering candles, the carved crucifix above the altar, the sisters themselves in their black habits. It was like looking upon their world doubled, made sharper, brighter, as if the glass knew more than the eye could see. They crossed themselves. They whispered prayers of gratitude. And yet, one or two of them lingered in hesitation. For in the stillness of the chapel, as the final cloth fell away, the silence seemed to deepen. The sisters swore the air grew colder, that the flame of one candle bent unnaturally toward the mirror as though drawn into it. They dismissed the thought. They told themselves it was imagination. But the feeling remained. At first, the mirror was adored. The sisters prayed before it during Vespers, their chants rising and echoing off both stone and glass. Some spoke of how it seemed to magnify the light of the candles, filling the chapel with a faint radiance. Others said it calmed them, that gazing upon their own reflections reminded them of the presence of God within every soul. The abbess herself recorded in her journal that the gift was a holy ornament, a reminder of heaven's gaze upon us. But slowly, the records began to shift. In December of that year, a notation in the convent's ledger reveals something peculiar. Sister Helena, assigned to clean the chapel each morning, wrote that she disliked being alone with the mirror, She described the surface as too alive and noted that her reflection sometimes seemed delayed, as though it lingered half a breath after she had moved. Another note weeks later mentioned Sister Clara's unease. She had knelt in prayer before the mirror, only to feel suddenly observed, as though someone else unseen had stepped into the room. When she lifted her head, she found herself staring not at her own face, but at the glint of something in the shadows behind her. She turned. The chapel was empty. But the most troubling record comes from January of 1885. Mother Eugenia herself, whose faith had never wavered, recorded a private admission. She wrote, "I sense a heaviness in the chapel, as though the prayers do not rise as easily as before. The sisters murmur of distractions, and when I gaze too long at the glass, I find my thoughts wandering to things I do not wish to see." She never described what those thoughts were. The convent, once a place of sameness and routine, began to change. The sisters, who once moved with quiet certainty, found themselves unsettled during prayer. Some lingered in front of the mirror longer than necessary, touching its surface, whispering their penance not to God but to their own reflections. Others avoided it altogether, walking quickly past the chapel door, refusing to meet their own gaze. The mirror divided them. It became a silent presence, always there, always watching. And though no one would admit it openly, each sister felt its pull. It was not violent, not sudden, but gradual, like a tide rising inch by inch beneath their feet. And then came the first incident. One night, during Compline, Sister Magdalena collapsed mid-prayer. She had been leading the hymn when her voice faltered, her knees buckling beneath her. The sisters rushed to her aid, but she did not speak. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, remained fixed on the mirror. She whispered something none of them understood, a single word, spoken in a language they could not place. When she awoke hours later, she remembered nothing. She claimed only that she felt herself drawn away, as if her voice had been swallowed by something vast and hollow. The abbess dismissed it as illness, but others began to whisper. More entries appeared in the convent's records. The sisters grew restless in sleep, some waking with the feeling of being watched. Dreams were recorded. Dreams of standing before the mirror, unable to turn away, even as hands pressed against the glass from the other side. They prayed harder, louder, as though to drive the thoughts away. But something wasn't right. The abbess, determined to maintain order, insisted the mirror remain covered during the day. Only at evening mass would it be unveiled, its surface reflecting the sisters' prayers. She wrote that discipline must prevail, that temptation comes in many forms. Yet even she began to falter. Her journal notes grow shorter, more frantic, as though she could not bring herself to write what she had seen. The mirror had become more than an ornament. It was a presence, a silent confessor, a witness to every whispered doubt, every faltering prayer. And still, the sisters endured it, for in their vows there was no room for fear. No room for suspicion of gifts meant to honor God. They told themselves it was nothing, that the mirror was only glass, that their unease was only weakness of spirit. But the truth lay waiting in their records, etched between the lines of routine. The year 1884 ended with the convent changed. The bells still rang. The prayers were still spoken. But the air was heavier now, the corridors colder, the silence thicker. The sisters carried on, but their eyes no longer met their own reflections so easily. And though none of them would say it aloud, they felt the shift. They felt the weight of the glass. They felt it watching. And that was only the beginning. The camera lingers on a chapel corridor, its stones breathing dampness, its silence deeper than any prayer. Candlelight trembles across plaster, faint shadows stretching long against the walls. The convent is quiet, as it always is. But within that quiet, a single detail begins to take hold. Something no one can ignore once it has been seen. It began with Sister Helena. She was alone in the chapel one morning. Her task, as always, to polish the candlesticks and sweep the stone floor before the sisters gathered for Mass. Her hands moved steadily, her lips repeating the psalms she had long since memorized. Her life was routine, predictable, safe. When she paused before the mirror, she thought nothing of it. She wiped her forehead, adjusted her veil, and let her eyes fall upon her reflection. For a moment, She only saw what she expected: a weary woman in habit, her features pale, her hands roughened from years of work. But then she closed her eyes, and in the stillness, her reflection did not. It blinked, a small, meaningless gesture, a moment so brief she questioned whether she had seen it at all. Her eyes snapped open, searching the glass with growing unease. There was nothing out of place, only her own gaze staring back. But something wasn't right. She backed away slowly, murmuring the sign of the cross, her broom falling to the stone floor with a hollow clatter. When the other sisters arrived, she said nothing. She could not bring herself to explain it, not even to the abbess. For what would it mean to claim your reflection had moved without you? But silence in a convent does not keep secrets for long. Whispers spread. Sister Helena's unease was noticed in her prayers, in her distracted stares, and when pressed, she told Sister Agnes in a hushed voice what she thought she had seen. Agnes tried to laugh it off, but the sound fell hollow in the chapel. Her own eyes strayed to the glass, and she found herself watching it longer than before. That night, 2 other sisters claimed to have heard something. It was near midnight when Sister Clara, on her turn at night watch, wrote in her journal that the mirror seemed to murmur faintly, as though a hymn were being sung through the glass. The sound was too soft to understand, but its rhythm reminded her of voices chanting, low and patient. She said she pressed her ear against the cold surface and felt as though it hummed against her skull. The next morning, she confessed it to Mother Eugenia, but the abbess only warned her against weakness. She said fatigue breeds illusions, that imagination tempts the faithful into sin. Yet Clara was not the only one. Over the following weeks, 3 more sisters began to speak quietly of what they had heard. Not only hymns, but sighs, whispers, the sound of someone breathing when the chapel was empty. They described it not as clear voices, but as impressions, soft currents that pressed into the silence, slipping through the cracks of their prayers. The abbess grew stern. She instructed the confessor, a visiting priest from the nearby parish, to take special care in hearing the sisters' admissions. But what he recorded unsettled him. One sister confessed that she no longer prayed to God while before the mirror, that instead she prayed to her reflection, asking it to absolve her. She described the glass as knowing her sins more deeply than she herself did. Another admitted she feared being left alone in the chapel at night. She felt that if she looked too long into the glass, she would see someone waiting behind her. The priest brought these confessions to Mother Eugenia. She listened in silence, her lips pressed tight, her eyes refusing to meet his. She told him only to record them discreetly, that the sisters were not to be chastised, but neither were they to speak of their fears to one another. But the silence only deepened the unease. By February of 1885, the convent's order of prayer had begun to fray. The sisters, once unified in song, now faltered. Voices trembled, eyes wandered, and always their gazes returned to the mirror. The journal of Sister Agnes provides one of the clearest accounts. She wrote that during Vespers, she watched her reflection in the glass. She claimed she saw her lips moving even when her voice fell silent, that her reflection continued the prayer for her, mouthing words she had not spoken, and she was not alone in this thought. Sister Magdalena, still weakened from her collapse weeks earlier, began to mutter in confession that she felt drawn to the glass, compelled to sit before it in silence. She said that when she closed her eyes, she could feel warmth against her skin, as though another presence leaned close enough to touch her. She whispered that she feared it was listening, but her words were not dismissed entirely. For one night, the abbess herself recorded hearing something. It was during the small hours, long after the convent had gone to sleep. Mother Eugenia had risen to pray alone, seeking clarity for her troubled sisters. She lit a single candle and knelt before the crucifix, facing the mirror across the chapel. She wrote that she prayed in silence, but that her words seemed answered, not aloud, not in sound, but in the shifting of the flame. She claimed the candle bent toward the glass, its fire drawn thin, as though the mirror inhaled. She did not return to the chapel alone after that night. Still, she could not remove the mirror. To do so would be to acknowledge what was happening, to admit that something was wrong. And for a convent, such an admission could shatter the foundation of their faith. So the mirror remained, and the sisters, in their silence, bore the weight of it. More confessions followed. One spoke of envy, saying her reflection looked holier than she could ever be. Another confessed a rage, describing the way her mirrored eyes seemed to mock her during prayer. A third wept that she no longer recognized her own face. The priest who heard these words left the convent visibly shaken. He told Mother Eugenia that he could not absolve what he did not understand, that the confessions were no longer sin, but of something else, something unspoken, something that lived between the sisters and the mirror. The abbess urged him to say nothing. She begged him to protect the convent's name. He left quietly and did not return. The sisters were left alone with their silence, and their silence began to break them. At night, more than one swore they heard the sound of footsteps pacing before the mirror. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, as though someone were circling in prayer. Yet, when the sisters entered the chapel, they found it empty. Sister Clara described in her journal a moment that shook her. She said she awoke in the dormitory to the sound of quiet singing. At first, she thought it was one of the others, but when she listened more closely, she realized the hymn was coming from the chapel below. She crept to the staircase, leaned into the darkness, and listened. It was her own voice. The song was hers, note for note, though she had not sung it. She covered her mouth in fear and ran back to bed, never telling the others what she had heard. The convent grew colder. The sisters spoke less. Their confessions multiplied, but their faith weakened. They clung to their rituals, even as those rituals felt increasingly hollow. The mirror stood unmoving, its glass spotless, its frame gleaming in candlelight. It offered no proof of what they feared, no evidence of what they whispered, only reflection, only silence. But in that silence, they began to hear themselves unravel, one reflection at a time. And though none would say it aloud, each sister began to wonder if the voices they heard were truly theirs, or if the mirror had begun to pray back. The camera drifts through the convent's chapel, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The crucifix looms in silence above the altar. Wax is hardened in thick rivers down the candlesticks. At the far end of the room, where shadow clings longest, the mirror stands waiting. It begins with small details, things easy to dismiss. One evening, as the sisters gathered for prayer, Sister Agnes noticed something peculiar. When she lit the candles near the mirror, their flames sank lower than the rest. The wicks hissed faintly, their glow dimmed as though starved of air. She tried replacing them. Fresh wax, new wicks, but always, when set before the mirror, they burned weaker. She said nothing. She only prayed harder. But others saw it too. Sister Clara remarked in her journal that she avoided lighting those particular candles. She claimed their smoke lingered unnaturally, coiling against the glass like breath against a cold window. She described the sensation of standing before the mirror as being near a mouth that draws and exhales. The abbess, when told, scolded her for speaking nonsense. She insisted all candles burn differently, that wax is imperfect, that the devil tempts faithful minds with foolish doubts. But the abbess did not light them herself. Over the weeks that followed, more sisters began to speak of shapes. At first, it was simple. One swore she had seen someone pass behind her reflection during morning prayers. Another thought she noticed the movement of a veil, though no one stood beside her. They dismissed it as tricks of the eye, as shadows bending in flickering light. But something wasn't right. The reports grew sharper, clearer. Sister Magdalena, still frail, swore she saw a figure standing where the crucifix should be, its outline tall and indistinct, its head bowed as though in mock prayer. When she blinked, it was gone. She told herself she had imagined it, yet when she looked again, her hands trembled, for her reflection remained a heartbeat longer than it should have. Others began to notice. They whispered that the glass held movements not their own, that sometimes, when they bent their heads in prayer, their reflections remained upright, that when they looked up suddenly, they caught glimpses of silhouettes fading into the glass. No one spoke of it aloud during meals or gatherings, but in confession, their voices faltered. One sister whispered that she feared the mirror was more alive than the rest of them, that it carried its own congregation, half seen and silent, worshiping from the other side. The priest who heard her confession did not write her words in a record. He only stared at the chapel wall for a long while after, his pen unmoving. The fear deepened when Sister Helena collapsed. It was during lauds, in the pale hours of morning. The sisters stood in their stalls, voices low and rhythmic, the chapel thick with shadows. Helena had taken her place nearest the mirror, her candle the only one lit before it. Halfway through the psalm, her voice cut short, her body stiffened. Her hymn book slipped from her hands, and with a sudden gasp, she fell against the stone floor. The sisters rushed to her, panic breaking the ritual silence. Her eyes were open wide, but unseeing. Her lips moved faintly, forming a single word again and again. It was not Latin. It was not any tongue the sisters knew. They leaned closer, desperate to catch it. Some said it sounded like a name. Others swore it was nothing human at all, only syllables twisted in exhaustion. When she awoke, hours later in her cell, Helena remembered nothing. Her skin was cold, her face pale. She claimed only that she had grown faint. But the sisters who had knelt beside her could not forget the sound of her voice. From that morning onward, the convent's fear became open. The abbess ordered more prayers. She commanded the sisters to fast, to purify themselves of doubt. But still the stories grew. One night, Sister Agnes lingered alone in the chapel after Compline. She admitted later that she had been testing herself, daring herself to face the glass. She sat in silence, candlelight flickering at her side. For long minutes, nothing stirred. And then she saw it, a silhouette, behind her reflection. It was faint, blurred as though submerged in water, but it stood unmistakably in the frame. Its shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm like breath. She spun, heart pounding. The chapel was empty, but when she looked back, her reflection was alone once more. She told no one, but her silence became its own confession. The convent descended further. The sisters began to pray with their eyes closed, fearful of catching a glimpse of something in the glass. Candles near the mirror burned half their length, while others stood tall. Shadows seemed to move when no one did. Mother Eugenia herself was not untouched. Her private notes, written in a hand increasingly shaky, reveal her own doubts. She wrote, "The sisters are frightened. They say they see figures. I cannot say they are wrong. Sometimes I, too, feel watched when I pray, but I must not allow this fear to spread. Faith cannot falter. Faith must be louder than fear." Her entries ended abruptly that spring. The silence of her pen spoke louder than her words. The convent stood divided between those who denied and those who believed. The sisters carried their unease into every hour of prayer, every step to the corridors. And always the mirror watched, its surface unbroken, its glass too clear. But those who looked too long knew what they had seen. Shadows that did not belong to them. Movements without cause. Candles that sank lower in its presence. And the faint sound of a name whispered by a voice no one recognized. The corridors of St. Rosalie's were never silent. There was always a faint shift of fabric as a sister passed. The drip of water into stone basins. The shuffle of worn shoes along flagstones. But in the long hours of afternoon, when the sun stretched thin through stained glass and the halls grew still, it was the mirror that seemed to breathe. The Venetian frame, heavy and gilded, caught what little light there was, pulling it inward as though it drank a whole. And in those late hours, one sister lingered too long before it. Her name was Sister Agnes. She was young compared to the others, barely 20 when she took her vows. Quiet, dutiful, the sort of novice the convent never had reason to correct. She sang softly, kept her place in prayer, and obeyed the rule without hesitation. But she had a tendency to look. Where others bowed their heads, Agnes lifted her eyes. Where others turned away from the mirror after crossing themselves, she lingered just a moment longer than most would dare. At first, no one thought much of it. Curiosity was not sin, at least not when kept in check. But Sister Agnes began to visit the refectory outside of hours, not to eat, not to clean, simply to sit, hands folded, on the long bench opposite the mirror, and she would watch. Hours at a time, she remained there, her eyes unblinking, her lips moving silently as though repeating prayers no one else could hear. The other sisters noticed. They whispered in cloisters, in laundries, in hushed corners where confession lingered too near. But something wasn't right. On the third day, one of the older sisters found her in the same position, rigid on the bench, her face pale as candle wax. The sister called her name. Agnes did not answer. Only when her arm was shaken did she stir, as if surfacing from some deep water. She turned slowly, smiled faintly, and whispered, "It sees more than I do." No one knew what she meant, yet the words spread, and with them a quiet unease. The prioress forbade her from returning to the refectory outside of meal times. She was told to join her sisters in prayer and penance, to keep her eyes from wandering, but the warning held no weight. Agnes returned. Some claimed they passed the doorway and saw her reflection move a fraction slower than she did. Others swore her lips in the glass whispered while her real mouth remained still. And then came the fasting. It began with bread. She pushed it away at meals, claiming she had no hunger. Then she refused broth, then water. Her hands trembled from the strain of it, but her eyes glowed with an almost fevered light. When pressed by the prioress to explain, she answered in a voice both calm and chilling. "The reflection is hungry enough for both of us." The words sank into the convent like a stone into deep water. No one laughed. No one scolded. They simply looked at her with unease, as though she crossed some unseen boundary that should never have been approached. Days passed. Her body weakened. She collapsed twice during prayer and was carried back to her cell where she lay pale and trembling. Still, her lips moved soundlessly, whispering prayers, or perhaps repeating something else entirely. But it was her eyes that terrified the sisters most. Whenever someone came close, they found her gaze drifting, not to their faces, not to the crucifix above her bed, but always, inevitably, to the far wall where no mirror stood, as if something unseen were waiting there. The confessional began to fill. Sisters came forward with strange admissions. Envy, suspicion. Shadows seen moving across the glass, voices faintly echoing at night. Some admitted they could not pray in the refectory at all. They felt the weight of eyes upon them. Even when alone, the chaplain listened, offered comfort, spoke of temptation and vigilance, but he too avoided the mirror, and Sister Agnes declined. By the second week, she refused not only food but speech. She answered nothing. She smiled at no one. Her hands remained folded, her body rigid, as though waiting. One evening, a younger novice found her standing before the mirror again. The room was dark, but for a single candle set near the frame. Its flame bent unnaturally toward the glass, flickering low, shadows trembling across the walls. Agnes stood so close her breath should have fogged the surface, but the glass remained clear. Too clear. The novice swore the reflection was smiling. Agnes was not, and that's when she screamed. The sound pierced the convent, sharp as shattering glass. Sisters rushed from every corridor, every stair, flooding into the refectory where they found her collapsed before the mirror, her hands pressed to her chest, her breath shallow. Her lips moved, struggling to form words, but the only phrase anyone understood was this: "Do not feed it, do not feed it." She was carried to her cell once more. A candle was lit beside her bed. The chaplain was called, but through the night she spoke only fragments. Whispers of hunger, whispers of doubling, whispers of something seen in the glass, something watching back. The sisters did not sleep. They took turns outside her cell, praying, listening, waiting. Some swore they heard scratching from the far side of the wall. And by dawn, the convent itself felt colder, the air heavier, as though something had been invited. And Sister Agnes, once the quietest, most obedient among them, now lay still, her body frail, her eyes fixed on the ceiling above. The sisters gathered around her. They prayed, they wept, they crossed themselves. But none dared cover the mirror, because deep down each of them feared the same thing, that if they did, they would see something in the glass, watching them too. And as the convent waited in silence, Sister Agnes finally turned her head. She smiled faintly and whispered a name no one recognized. A name she could not possibly have known. The room froze. The candle beside her guttered low, its flame bending once again toward nothing at all. The sisters backed away, one by one, their prayers faltering. The prioress herself looked shaken, her rosary slipping loose between trembling fingers. Because in that moment, in the shadowed silence of her cell, it was no longer clear if Sister Agnes was praying, or being prayed to, and the mirror, silent in the refectory, waited, as though hungry still. The mirror stood in the convent's chapel, its surface dulled by the thin light of candles that never seemed to reach it. The stone walls breathed with silence, and yet the silence did not feel empty. At first, the sisters treated the mirror as an object of suspicion, but not of terror. They avoided its gaze during their prayers, turning their bodies so as not to catch their own reflection in its glass. Some suggested that it was nothing but distraction, a temptation to vanity. Others whispered of darker things. By late winter, the unease had grown too heavy to ignore, and so, in quiet agreement, they attempted their first act of defiance. They draped the mirror in heavy cloth, a thick, woven covering taken from the storage rooms. It was a simple gesture, one meant to rob the mirror of its power, at least in their sight. For the first time in months, the chapel felt lighter, the air less strained. For a moment, they believed it was enough, but something wasn't right. The next morning, as the first sister entered to tend the altar, she froze in the doorway. The cloth was torn, not lifted, not removed, torn, as though something had clawed its way out from beneath the fabric. Threads dangled loose, the fabric hanging in shredded strips across the mirror's frame. And in the faint morning light, the glass shone, uncovered, waiting. The sister turned and ran to fetch the others. Soon the convent stood in the chapel, staring at what should have been impossible. No one spoke. No one dared touch the ruined cloth. It was then the journals began. Not official records, not public confessions, but private writings, scrawled in ink by candlelight, locked away in desk drawers or tucked beneath pillows. And when those journals were discovered years later, they told a story that was far darker than anyone had expected. One sister described standing in the chapel late at night. She had gone in search of silence, but found only whispers. She wrote that they were faint, like voices pressed against the glass. Prayers, mutters, supplications too low to distinguish, but too steady to dismiss as imagination. Another wrote of dreams. She claimed the mirror had followed her into sleep, that when she closed her eyes, she saw it waiting in the dark behind her. When she opened them again, the glass stood in her mind's eye unblinking. The voices became clearer in her dreams, though she did not recognize the language. But worst of all were the entries written not in fear, but in devotion. One sister described kneeling before the mirror, believing it was no longer a threat, but a vessel. She recorded words of gratitude for the presence she felt inside the glass. She begged it for guidance, as though it were something more sacred than the cross itself. She ended one entry with a single sentence, written in a trembling hand. "Forgive me, Lord, but when I pray the one who listens back." And that's when the pattern began. Small gestures, hidden in plain sight. Candles left burning overnight in front of the mirror. Scraps of parchment with verses half erased, tucked at its base. A drop of wine poured not for communion, but as though an offering. Each time the abbess noticed, she corrected them. She scolded. She ordered. She tried to remind them that their devotion was meant for God alone. But the mirror did not listen, and neither, it seemed, did some of the sisters. There was one morning when a sister was found in the chapel, her knees bloodied from kneeling on stone, her head bent low, whispering something over and over again to glass. When pulled away, her lips continued to move, though her voice was gone. She refused food that day, refused water. When pressed, she only murmured through cracked lips, "It answers. You only need to ask." The abbess ordered the mirror covered again, this time with heavier cloth, nailed into the wooden frame. She forbid any sister to enter the chapel alone. But the next dawn, the covering was torn once more, not ripped by hand, not by accident. The fabric lay on the floor in ribbons, the nails bent outward as though forced from within, and the mirror stood bare again. Some sisters swore the glass looked different in the morning light, darker, as though stained from within. Others claimed to see faint handprints pressed against the inside of the surface, marks that vanished when touched. The abbess told them it was imagination. She insisted on discipline, prayer, fasting, but even she began to keep her eyes lowered when walking past the chapel door. The journals only deepened the suspicion. Their pages were filled with contradictions, some pleading for forgiveness for ever standing near the glass, others quietly praising what they felt living within it. The words blurred the line between fear and reverence, and soon the convent itself began to feel divided. Some of the sisters carried rosaries more tightly, prayed more fervently, and walked in silence past the chapel. Others lingered there longer than they should, their footsteps hesitant to leave. No one admitted it aloud, but by then everyone knew the mirror was no longer an object in their chapel. It had become a presence in their lives, and though they had tried to cover it, it would not remain hidden. That night, the sisters gathered in the refectory for supper. Bowls of thin broth were set before them, bread split into even pieces. No one spoke much, their voices hushed as though in fear of being overheard. It was then that Sister Margaret, a woman known for her stern devotion, set down her spoon and whispered to the others around her. She told them she had seen one of the sisters. She would not name who, slipping from her bed after midnight. She had followed her quietly into the chapel, and there, in the candlelight, she had watched the sister kneel before the uncovered glass, not in fear, not in prayer to God, but in worship. The others stiffened. Some shook their heads. Some whispered prayers under their breath. But no one asked who it was. They were too afraid of the answer. The abbess demanded all journals be turned over. She burned them in the courtyard, page by page, as the sisters watched. Ink bled black in the firelight. Words turned to ash. But the silence that followed was worse. Because though the pages were gone, their contents had already seeped into memory, and there was no fire hot enough to burn away belief. The abbess locked the chapel at night. She posted 2 sisters at the door to guard it. She demanded obedience. But even she must have known it was futile, because each morning, when the door was opened, the candles at the mirror's base were found burned to their ends. Their wax dripped in neat pools upon the floor. No one had entered. No one had lit them, and yet they burned. The sisters stopped questioning how. They stopped asking who. Instead, some began to leave their own offerings in secret. A flower, a scrap of cloth, a bead from a rosary string. Each gift disappeared by morning, and no one spoke of it. It was Sister Beatrice who broke first. Her journal was found beneath her mattress after she collapsed in the garden. The entries within were frantic, the writing uneven, blotched with tears. She wrote of standing in front of the mirror at night, unable to look away. She wrote of hearing her own voice echo back to her in words she did not understand. And then, at the end, a final confession. I have prayed to God my whole life, but only here do I feel I am heard. The abbess read those words aloud. Then she locked them away in her chambers. But the damage had been done. The sisters no longer trusted one another. Each wondered who among them still prayed to God, and who had begun to pray to something else. Meals grew quieter. Confessionals filled with vague, trembling admissions. Whispers spread faster than hymns. And the mirror remained, uncovered, unmoved, watching. By the time spring arrived, the convent was no longer a place of shared faith. It was a place of secret rituals, hidden prayers, and a silence that grew heavier with every passing night. The mirror was never alone, and deep down, each sister knew it, because every time they passed the chapel door, they felt it waiting. The candlelight flickers across stone, a long nave, shadows press against the edges of silence. The sisters gather. Their veils whisper against wood as they kneel, waiting for the bell to strike. The mirror has not been moved. It stands where it always has stood, too large to carry, too heavy to discard. A dark rectangle leaned against the apse wall, draped once, uncovered again, waiting. They had decided, reluctantly, that the only way forward was prayer, a mass, The air is colder near the glass. One could feel it even in the marrow, a bite of stillness that did not belong inside the house of God. But still the abbess raised her hand. Still she began the litany, and the voices rose with her. The sisters answered in turn, low at first, soft against the draft that moved through the nave. Their words rolled, syllables falling like beads across stone. The rhythm was familiar, safe, steady, but something wasn't right. The sound did not remain steady. It swelled, not with the organ, for the organ was silent, not with the voices alone. For the sisters swore later that they heard themselves speaking, yet none recalled shaping the words. The chant thickened. It pressed against the walls. It grew louder than breath, louder than intention. And then there was a thread woven into the Latin, a rhythm that did not match the Psalms. Low, strange, almost like the echo of an echo, sliding under the words they thought they knew. One sister's voice broke. She lowered her head, clutching the pew until her knuckles whitened. Another gasped, whispering that she could not stop her tongue, that the syllables came without her will. The abbess, pale, tried to steady the sound. She raised her hand again, insisting on order, on obedience. But the chant continued, and that's when she heard it, her own mouth, forming sounds she had never spoken, a prayer to something unnamed, something that listened. The mirror did not reflect the altar flame as it once had. Instead, the glass seemed to darken, swallowing light. The candles bent low, their smoke drawn toward the surface as though to a breathless pull. The abbess faltered. She staggered one step, her hand gripping the wood of the altar rail. Her sisters rose half from their knees, torn between devotion and terror. The chant thundered. No one remembered the words. No one admitted they belonged to them. And then silence. The abbess collapsed. Her veil touched stone, her lips pale and trembling. The sisters rushed forward, circling her, calling her name. Her chest rose once, shuddering, as though caught between two forces. And then, with the last air she could draw, she whispered, "It is not our God who answers." Her eyes rolled white, her hands slackened, and the nave was filled with the sound of 20 breaths, waiting frozen, unwilling to exhale. The mirror remained where it was, still, silent, its surface smooth. But for a moment, just a moment, several swore they saw their reflections turn away, not vanish, not fade, simply turn, as if the women in the glass no longer wished to look back. From that night on, no sister would kneel in the apse after dusk. No candle would be lit without two watching, and every prayer carried the weight of suspicion. They had gathered to honor their God. They left whispering of something else entirely. And in the days that followed, silence was no longer silence. It was waiting. It was watching. And the mirror never blinked. The stone corridor is empty. Cold air seeps through the joints where mortar has cracked with time. A single iron lamp sways gently, its flame bending against a draft that should not exist. At the far end stands a door. Heavy, wooden, sealed. It is not used anymore. It is not meant to be. The sisters had decided, after the night of the broken litany, that the chamber could no longer remain open. They could not pray there. They could not enter. They could not trust what might come from it. So they walled it off, stone laid over stone, mortar pressed into the frame, until the room behind was no longer visible. Only a line in the wall gave away what had once been a door, and yet the door remained. The sisters swore they could hear it. Late at night, after the final bell, footsteps, pacing, back and forth, measured, patient, the sound was unmistakable. Heel to stone, a body moving within the room. No one could enter anymore. At first, they told themselves it was memory, that echoes clung to the convent walls. That sound carried strangely in the old stone. But as the night stretched, the rhythm did not fade. The footsteps always began at the same hour, after matins, when silence should have been complete. One sister pressed her ear against the sealed wall. She later whispered that she felt vibration, not only sound, the faint tremor of weight, as though something alive was crossing the room on the other side. But the room was empty. They had sealed it themselves. And then came the knocking. 3 taps. Always 3. Slow, measured, never hurried, never desperate. Just enough to remind them it was there. Visitors who stayed at the convent, clergy, pilgrims, even a mason called to inspect the work, reported the same thing. At night they would wake, listen, and hear it. 3 taps against the door that should no longer exist. But something wasn't right. The sound was not muffled, as though striking from behind stone. It was sharp, clear, immediate, as if the knock was on the surface of the new wall itself. The sisters began to avoid the corridor. They left the lamps unlit past dusk. They prayed from their cells instead of the chapel. Still, the footsteps continued. Still, the knocks returned. One visitor, a young priest from the nearby parish, insisted on keeping watch through the night. He positioned himself on a bench opposite the sealed chamber, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the wall. For hours, nothing stirred. But then, he heard it, the faintest step, the measured rhythm of pacing. He leaned forward, straining to hear, until his whole body ached with the silence between. Then 3 taps. Clear, deliberate. He swore it came from the door itself, not from behind it. From the door. The priest did not return a second night. The abbess was gone now, her words still haunting them. Her sisters could not find courage without her. Some wanted to tear down the wall, to prove the room was empty. Others refused, fearing what they might find if it was not. So the room remained sealed, banished. But the sound was not banished with it. Every night the convent waited, breath held, listening, for the steps that circled in patient rhythm, for the 3 slow knocks against stone. And though no one entered, though no one dared to break the seal, they all knew the truth. The room was not empty. It was waiting. And one night, the sisters feared the knocking would be answered. The convent stood in silence. Stone walls faded into the pale wash of morning light, their surfaces damp with night air. A mist hung low in the courtyard, moving like breath through the cloisters, swallowing the sound of footsteps. From a distance, nothing seemed wrong. The building looked as it always had. But inside, something had shifted. Officials arrived, men in dark cassocks, their collars stark white against black cloth. Their pace was deliberate, their expressions fixed with the confidence of men who carried orders larger than themselves. They entered through the front gates without hesitation. No bows to the sisters waiting at the threshold. No acknowledgement of the unease that lingered in their eyes. They came not to listen. They came to decide. The mirror was brought into question. The voices of the sisters who had witnessed its influence, who had heard the footsteps, who had felt the knocking, were dismissed one by one. The officials sat in the refectory. Papers were spread across the long table, quills scratching against parchment, their words recorded in a hand no sister could read. The message was clear. The mirror was an object, nothing more, a frame, a surface of polished glass. A relic, yes, but without power, without threat. The sisters protested, some quietly, in whispers along the corridor, others more directly, pressing their concerns before the men who had been sent. But each response was met with the same thin smile, the same dismissive tone. Fear was not fact, and stories were not evidence. The footsteps, they said, could be explained. Old buildings carried sound strangely. The knocking, imagination, nothing more. The unease the sisters described, hysteria, passed from one to the next like an illness. But something wasn't right. The more they insisted the mirror was harmless, the less it was spoken of in the records. Entries in the convent's logbooks ended abruptly. Dates no longer matched the sisters' memories. The night of the knocking was not there. The ceiling of the room vanished from the page. Entire weeks of prayer, silence, and fear were absent, as if they had never existed. And then the transfers began. Sisters who had spoken too loudly were summoned, not by the abbess, she was gone now, but by letters bearing the seal of the diocese. They were told they were needed elsewhere, a convent 2 towns over, an abbey across the river, a hospice at the edge of the city. One by one they left, their farewells brief, their voices heavy. And for some, there were no farewells at all. Names that once filled the prayer rosters no longer appeared. The chalkboard that marked daily duties was wiped clean, their assignments reassigned without question. When the sisters asked where they had gone, no answer came. It was as though they had never been there. A silence fell over the convent, not the silence of prayer, but of fear. The younger sisters lowered their eyes when asked about the mirror. The older ones shook their heads, unwilling to speak. Those who remembered were careful, their words chosen, their voices quiet, because they had seen what happened when a sister spoke too much. The officials did not return after the final transfer. Their work was finished. The chamber remained sealed. The records were corrected. But beneath the order, something lingered. The footsteps had not stopped. The knocking had not stopped. Only the telling of it had been forbidden. Those who remained carried it in silence. They walked past the corridor quickly, their heads down, hands folded, lips moving in quiet prayer. But every night, when the convent fell still, they heard it, pacing, measured, patient, and then the 3 slow taps. Clear, deliberate, each one a reminder that no matter what the records claimed, no matter what the officials had declared, the room was not empty, and as the silence deepened, a new fear grew in them. That one night, when the knocking came, someone would answer it. The convent stands alone on the hill. Its stone walls are pale with age, blotched by moss and rain. Windows are shuttered, broken in places, staring outward like hollow eyes. The grass that once lined the courtyard has grown wild, bending in the wind, creeping against the steps where processions once climbed. The year is 1901. The convent has been abandoned, but in the village below, people say it is not empty. They say faces still gather at the windows. They say shadows move where no one lives. And sometimes, after nightfall, a single candle burns. But there are no sisters left to light it. The last of the nuns have been transferred away years earlier. Records say nothing more than relocation. Letters never explained. And the new convents, those to which the sisters were supposedly sent, claim never to have received them. It was as though they had stepped out of time itself. The diocese made no effort to clarify. The convent was locked, fenced off, and left a ruin, but something wasn't right. The villagers could still feel it. At first, they avoided the hill. Children were warned not to wander there. Farmers did not graze their animals on its fields. Travelers passing through asked directions around it rather than over. It became a place spoken of only in passing, mentioned quickly then left behind. But as the years dragged on, silence began to gather its own weight. And silence is never perfect. By the late 19th century, stories began to spread. One boy, searching for a lost dog, swore he saw a woman in the upper window, veiled and pale, staring outward. He ran to tell his mother, but when the adults climbed the hill with lanterns, the window was empty. Another night, a pair of men returning from the tavern claimed to hear bells ringing faintly from within the chapel. They stood listening in the frost, certain of the sound, until it stopped. The bell rope, when checked the next day, was cut clean through, and then came the candle. Always one candle. In the highest window, a single, flickering flame that appeared at unpredictable hours. Never the same night twice, never the same hour. Sometimes it shone just after dusk, sometimes near dawn. Always a solitary light, glowing against the glass. But when the villagers investigated by daylight, the rooms were bare, and the mirrors inside reflected only emptiness. The convent became a place of watching. Villagers found themselves glancing toward it, without meaning to, scanning the windows as though expecting someone to appear. They did not speak of it openly, but they all felt it. The hill no longer belonged to them. It belonged to something else. Travelers, too, began to add their voices. A group of merchants from the coast, sheltering the village one stormy night, described seeing a face illuminated in the upper floor. A nun, they thought, except her face looked wrong. She seemed too tall for the frame, her neck too long, her features blurred as though pressed too close to the glass. A schoolteacher on holiday passed by and noted a curious sight. The faint sound of footsteps on stone. Though the path was empty, he described it in his journal, though never mentioned it to the villagers. And one man, an archivist passing through on his way to Paris, wrote of something colder. He said that as he looked upon the convent, he felt watched, not as though a person seen him, but as though the building itself knew his presence. He hurried on, refusing to glance back, though every step pulled him toward turning. The stories built slowly, layer upon layer. None were violent, none were dramatic. They were small, subtle, easily dismissed if one wished to dismiss them. But no one did, because everyone at some point experienced something. One farmer's wife awoke in the night to hear knocking from the distance. 3 sharp taps, always 3. She shook her husband awake, but by the time he listened, the sound was gone. A traveler sleeping near the edge of the village swore he heard the same pattern echoing faintly against his window pane. 3 knocks, slow, steady, and once, when a group of curious boys dared each other to climb the convent steps, they placed their ears against a sealed wooden door. They listened in silence, hearts pounding, breaths held, and they heard it, 3 taps. From the other side, they fled screaming into the night. Word spread quickly, and after that, no one climbed the steps again. The convent remained sealed, but not silent. Its presence grew heavier with each passing season, as though something inside was pushing outward, pressing against its walls. And the villagers quietly began to believe that whatever had been sealed inside was still alive. They whispered to the mirror. They whispered that it had not been destroyed, only hidden. And they wondered if the sisters had been hidden with it. One older man, one of the last to remember the convent in its working days, swore that the knocking came not from wood, but from glass, that the sound was the sharp edge of knuckles against a mirror surface. But no one wanted to test it. The diocese denied everything. Officials dismissed the stories as superstition, fueled by the isolation of rural life. They said the candle was nothing more than moonlight glinting off broken glass. They said the knocking was birds or shifting wood. They said faces in the windows were tricks of shadow. But they never explained the footsteps. They never explained the journals. And they never explained why they, too, began avoiding the hill. By 1901, the convent was left to rot. Its gates rusted. Its gardens grew wild. The chapel's cross leaned forward, bent by storms. Tiles slipped from the roof, shattering on stone. The air smelled of damp, of mildew, of something left unclean too long. Yet every so often, a light still burned, faint, fragile, but unmistakable. One traveler, a French photographer, tried to capture it. He set up his equipment in the field below, framing the upper window. Hours passed in silence. Nothing, only darkness. And then, without warning, the candle appeared. He took the shot, hands trembling, plates prepared with care. But when he developed the image days later, the window showed no flame, only the outline of the glass. And yet the surface of the plate bore faint scratches. 3 lines side by side, as though something had scored the emotion from within. He destroyed the negative, and refused to speak of it again. The villagers learned to ignore the hill. They built their lives around it, never acknowledging its presence, though it loomed over them every day. But silence is not forgetfulness. Silence is a kind of worship. And the convent stood, waiting, because something inside had not yet left. And though no voices prayed within its walls, and no sisters walked its halls, the windows still watched, the footsteps still paced, and the candles still burned, waiting for someone to see, waiting for someone to open the door. And in the village below, though no one admitted it aloud, each family prayed the same prayer at night. Not a prayer for blessing, not a prayer for mercy, but a prayer that the convent silence would never break, because they knew, deep down, what silence really was. It was not absence. It was holding its breath. And one day, it would exhale. The convent sits in ruin, its walls buckled by time, its windows swallowed by ivy. A silence holds it, a silence so complete it seems deliberate, as if placed there. For more than a century, no one has lived inside these walls. And yet, the locals insist it is not empty. They say the convent still keeps watch, that deep in its sealed heart, something remains. Something chained, covered, hidden, but not forgotten. At the edge of the property, The old gates lean forward as though bowing under the weight of years. The iron is rusted, the lock fuse in place. Children who once dared each other to climb the fence never made it far. They say the air changes near the threshold, that the woods fall quiet, that even the wind avoids the convent grounds. It was supposed to have ended in 1901, when the last of the sisters abandoned their cells, when the final candle was snuffed, when the ledger was closed, and the church sealed the records away. But not everything left. Not everything could be carried out. There is talk of a mirror, a tall, oval glass once hung in the refectory. An ordinary object, said the officials, but it had already drawn too much attention. Too many whispered stories. Too many eyes that claimed to see more than a reflection. So it was left behind. Chained, veiled, hidden where no pilgrim, no priest, no passerby might disturb it again. But silence is never complete. And rumors, like roots, will always find a way through stone. One story begins with a trespasser, a young historian in the 1970s who slipped through a broken section of the wall. He carried a notebook, a torch, and the arrogance of someone convinced that history could be captured on paper. He wrote of the collapsed cloisters, the skeletal arches. He sketched the cracked tiles of the chapel floor. But then his notes change. They grow scattered, fragmented. He wrote of hearing something. Knocks, 3 of them, rhythmic, measured, coming from the sealed wing of the convent. And he wrote of a feeling, the sense that he was being watched, though every window had long been emptied of its glass. The final line in his journal is almost unreadable. A single phrase scratched into the paper until the page nearly tore. It hasn't stopped. He left that night, abandoning his bag, his coat, his torch. Only the notebook was recovered. He was never seen again. But something wasn't right. The notebook was not found outside the convent. It was discovered years later, inside, by surveyors sent to map the ruin, lying in the exact place the mirror had once hung. Locals say the mirror is still there, behind those brick walls, chained to its stand, shrouded beneath a cloth that has never been lifted. But some also say the cloth moves, that in certain storms, when the convent roof groans and the lightning finds the windows, you can see a shape beneath the veil, not still, but shifting, as though the mirror breathes. The last living sister of the convent never returned to see it. In her old age, when questioned by a young priest about the object, she refused even to speak its name. She looked at him only once, and her voice cracked as she whispered, "Do not uncover it, for it has not stopped watching." Her warning was never written down. It passed only by memory, from one ear to another, like a thread stretched thin, and memory fades. But the silence does not. The silence of the convent remains. Heavy, certain, as though guarding something that has not yet finished its work. In recent years, the ruins have been sealed again, the walls reinforced, the gates chained a second time. Signs warn of collapse, of danger, of trespassing penalties. But that is not why the villagers keep their distance. They avoid it for another reason. They avoid it because of the light. More than one traveler has spoken of it. A single candle, flickering in a window of the upper floor. Though the rooms are gutted, though the staircases have fallen to dust, the flame continues to appear. It burns for hours at a time, and then it is gone. But what unsettles those who claim to see it is not the flame itself. It is what comes after, because when they look again, the light has moved from window to window, as though carried in a hand. But something wasn't right. One traveler insisted that what he saw was not just a candle at all, that it was a reflection, a flame caught in glass, burning in a mirror no one should have uncovered. The records say otherwise. The church still insists the mirror was an object without meaning, that no veil remains, that no chain was ever set. But the villagers know better. They know that the convent keeps its silence because something still waits inside. And every so often, when the night is at its coldest and the clouds sink low over the spire, someone hears it again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, from behind the sealed wall. And that's when he heard it. The caretaker assigned to patrol the ground swore that on his final night, he stopped near the chapel door. The air was thick, unmoving, His lantern flame stilled. And then it came. 1, 2, 3. A sound not loud but certain. Not random. Not the breaking of stone. Not the settling of wood. A sound made with intent. He quit that night. He never returned. And so the convent waits. Its ruins sealed. Its halls empty. Its walls whispering only to themselves. But within those walls, the mirror remains, chained beneath its veil, watching, and perhaps, even now, waiting for someone to look again. Philosophical close. If a reflection watches us longer than we watch it, is it still a reflection? Or something waiting to cross over? Soft close line with next video teaser. And deep within another convent, another object waits, its watchers gone, but its gaze unbroken.